All right, for today's video and today's lesson, what we're going to be doing is just reviewing the skills from 9.2 and 9.3. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the notes and kind of rework a couple of the questions just to make sure we get a little bit of review. And then I'm going to go to the homework and kind of go over some of the common errors. So 9.2, we'll start with that one. That was solving equations by graphing. Now, the equations you're going to be given are quadratic equations, and one side will be equaling 0. So this isn't really a graph, but we can solve it by graphing by pretending that that 0 is a y and graphing that related function. And then your x-intercepts are your solutions or your roots of the equation. Okay, so your answers are the x-intercepts. Remember that there are 3 types of solutions we could get. We can have an answer that has 2 solutions, so that would be a graph that has 2 x-intercepts. We could have one solution if there's one x-intercept, meaning that vertex is on the x-axis. Or we could have no solutions if the graph opens up and the vertex is above it, so it'll never cross the x-axis, or if it opens down and the vertex is below the x-axis, so it never crosses. So these both would have 2 solutions, these both have 1, pretend that touches, and these both have 0. So there's kind of 3 answers that we could get. Okay, to graph these, or to actually do the problems, if you're given a equation to graph, again, we're going to graph it as if it was a y equals x squared minus 5x plus 4. So remember, to graph a parabola, we're thinking about negative b over 2a to find that vertex. So this would be negative 5 over 2 times 1, which would give us 5 halves. When we make our table, 5 halves, that would be 2.5. We're going to substitute that into our equation. So we would have 5 halves squared minus 5 times 5 halves plus 4. So that would give us 25 fourths minus 25 seconds plus 4. So this would give us negative 25 halves. And then we can rewrite 4 as 16 fourths, which gives us negative 9 fourths. And so that would turn into negative 2 1/4, so negative 2.25. Okay. Now again, you don't necessarily want to have all decimals for these. It's kind of nice to have whole numbers. So we could just go to 2 and then to 1 and then 3 and 4. So the jump from here is both just a half and then 1 and 1. So you would substitute in those values, substitute 1 into x for your equation. That'll give you 0. Substitute in 2, that gives you negative 2. Substitute in 3 gives you negative 2. Substitute 4 gives you 0. And so you would graph those points. As best you can. And then your answers are your x-intercepts. So we want to make sure we write the answer. The answer is 1 and 4. Okay. In the homework, there were also problems where they gave you the graph. So kind of ignore what number 4 says. Say they give you a picture of the graph and they asked you to find the solution. The solution is the x-intercept. So you would just look at the picture and just state what the x-intercept is. There's nothing you need to solve necessarily. Just use that picture and say, here the x-intercept is whatever points it happens to be on the problem. Okay, so that was 9.2. Again, it's the first way of solving quadratic equations, and it's by graphing. So you're graphing the parabola and looking at the x-intercepts. And again, make sure when you're graphing it that you show the table and you show your work to find your points. Don't just put a random graph on your paper and call it a day. Okay, show your work and show your steps. All right, for 9.3, I'm going to go over a couple highlighted questions just to kind of reiterate a couple points and some common errors I saw, and then I'll go over yesterday's homework and go over some common mistakes just to make sure we're all on the same page. I'm trying to do my best to type out answers to you guys and kind of explanations, but that's kind of hard to do just by typing it out. So please watch this fully because I think it'll help some of you that had things incorrect. In all of the problems on example 1, we have a single value squared. So we have like just an x squared, we have an r squared, a c squared, and in all these cases we would just be getting the value squared by itself. In example E, to get k squared by itself, we're dividing by 25. And one of the common errors, it's not necessarily an error, but one of the common things I saw was a lot of you guys changing things into decimals. Please leave them as fractions. It will make it a lot easier, especially if we notice something like this. When we take our square root, we can take the square root of 9, which is 3, and we can take the square root of 25, which is 5. And so it's really easy if we keep that as a fraction to just take the square root without having to use a calculator. The other error I'm noticing is we're forgetting that it's plus or minus. Okay, so again, when we think about what number, when we square it, we get 9/25. There are two numbers, positive 3/5 and negative 3/5. When we square both of those, we get 9/25. So we have two answers, plus 3/5 and negative 3/5. Okay, in example 2, we would, again, need to isolate that x squared. So we would start by adding 7 to both sides. We have 2x squared equals 15. Divide both sides by 2. We get x squared equals 15 halves. This is one where you don't know the square root of 15 or the square root of 2, so we would just leave it as plus or minus root 15 halves. Again, if the problem says to round to the nearest hundredth, you can grab a calculator and calculate that, but if not, we can just leave it as that fraction. Okay, the area I saw the biggest number of mistakes was in problems that looked like this in example 3. So I messaged a lot of you to kind of rewatch this part, but I want to explain again how we're going to do these. So in B, we have a quantity being squared. Okay, so that m minus 4 is being squared. Now we learned in the last chapter that that meant m minus 4 times n minus 4, and we could distribute this. But this gives us a trinomial, and we don't quite know how to solve that yet. We will get to that in a couple lessons, but for now we don't want to make it larger. We want to keep it as a binomial squared. Okay. Some other people were distributing the 2 to get m squared minus 4 squared. That does not work, right? M minus 4 means m minus 4 times itself, and you would get that trinomial. And then another error I saw was some of you were distributing the 3 in. You also can't do that because you have the squared there. So it's not just an m minus 4, but it's m minus 4 squared. So we can't just distribute that 3 in. Okay, so the way we need to go about solving this is to isolate what's being squared. So we need to get that m minus 4 by itself. So we need to divide both sides by 3 to get m minus 4 by itself. Okay, right here is now where we want to undo it being squared. So we want to take the square root. That's a minus. Okay, when we take the square root, this is the other error I saw. When we take the square root, that's when we get the plus or minus 2. So directly after you take the square root, that's where you get your plus or minus. Okay, now to get m by itself, we're going to add 4 to both sides. So that would be 4 plus or minus 2. These are two answers. This means 4 plus 2, and then it means 4 minus 2. So we get two answers. 4 plus 2 is 6. 4 minus 2 is 2. And those are our two answers. Okay, so quite a few errors in those ones. Again, I know that this is new and it's kind of hard to learn just from video as opposed to being in class, but please make sure you're watching the video fully and re-watching sections as you get to them. If, when you get to the homework, you forget how to do it. Okay. All right, let's go over one more C, and then we'll kind of revisit the homework and look at some errors. So again, in C, we need to get that a minus 3 because that's the quantity being squared. We need to get that all by itself. So we need to divide both sides by 4. So this gives us quantity a minus 3 squared equals 8. Okay, this is the step we need to undo it being squared. So we're going to take the square root. Okay, right away when we take that square root of 8, we get plus or minus root 8. We don't know what root 8 is. It's a decimal that goes on forever, so we're just going to leave it as root 8. We're going to add 3 to both sides, and so this gives us 3 plus or minus root 8. And then again, you can, if you needed to round it to the nearest hundredth, if the instructions said you get a calculator, you would do 3 plus root 8, and then you would do 3 minus root 8 to get your two answers. Okay. So hopefully that kind of clarified a couple errors. Again, kind of keeping things as fractions is going to be very helpful. And then just really watch out for problems like B and C. Okay, let's go to the homework real quick, and I want to go over just a couple things I saw. All right, on number 15, some of you were saying no real solution, but you have, when you divide both sides by -3, you would get a 0 here, and the square root of 0 is just 0. So this is one answer, and it's just x equals 0. Okay, on 16, make sure once you take that square root right here of 100, that right away you write that answer as plus or minus 10. So again, two answers, 10 squared is 100, negative 10 squared is also 100. Okay, on number 18, again, I highly recommend that you keep it as fractions, and I messaged quite a few of you this. It's not wrong to write it as a decimal, but it's a lot easier to keep it as a fraction, especially if you don't have a calculator or you're not given a calculator in a certain situation. So when you get to this step, leave it as 49/9 because the square root of 49 is 7, the square root of 9 is 3, and that's really easy to do in your head without having to use a calculator. Okay, and then the biggest errors I saw were on 20 kind of through 23. So hopefully going over example 3 again kind of clarified it. But to go through number 20, to start, we're going to take the square root of both sides. So we have to undo it being squared. So you're going to take the square root so that you're left with just an x minus 1. When you take the square root of the other side, you have that plus or minus 2. So again, right away when you take that square root, you have your plus or minus. Then we would need to add 1 to both sides. So that gives us this line of 1 plus or minus 2. This is two answers then, 1 plus 2 and 1 minus 2. So 1 plus 2 gives you 3, 1 minus 2 gives you -1. And that's how you would get your two answers. Okay, in 21, again, we have a quantity being squared. So right away, we're going to take the square root to undo it being squared. Right away, that gives us that plus or minus 9. Adding 1 to both sides, we would get that 1 plus or minus 9. And then you divide by 2. So you get this answer here of 1 plus or minus 9, all divided by 2. Okay, and then you're going to calculate this. So you're going to do the plus version. So you're going to do 1 plus 9 over 2, which is 10 over 2, which is 5. And then you're going to do 1 minus 9 over 2, which is -8 over 2, which is -4. And that's how you get your two answers. Okay, 22 and 23 really follow that same pattern. So you're taking the square root. Again, probably the biggest error I saw was either not taking the square root or forgetting that plus or minus. So in this, we end up with that -5 plus or minus 3 over 4. So you have -5 plus 3 over 4, which is -2 over 4, which is -1/2. And then you have the minus version, so -5 minus 3 over 4, -8 over 4, which is -2. Okay, and that's how you would get your two separate answers. Okay, so hopefully that's helpful. Please go back to your work, especially if I sent you a message saying you had some things incorrect, and kind of revisit it and make sure that you can make some corrections on it. All right, so today's homework again is just review of 9.2 and 9.3. If you still need extra help, go back and watch the other full videos I did on those notes to make sure that you fully understand it before we move forward.